Hello everyone, this is Poohhead189, fantasy writer, historian, and a huge loser nerd with a stupid name, and today we are going to be dissecting and discussing everything we can say about the Blades, from their origins to their classifications to their weaponry. However, let's begin with the basics. If you do not know who the Blades are, or need a reminder, the Blades are the Emperor of Cyrodiil's personal guard and agents. In fact, an alternative name of theirs is the Imperial Intelligence Agency. They live and die by the Emperor, and serve him loyally for life. They are pretty much a military branch, but do not generally partake in military actions unless the Emperor's presence is required. Sounds simple, right? So, what we need to acknowledge is that, due to its elite nature and status, the Blades are essentially a military order, very similar to a knightly order. While the members of the Blades do not have titles or land, they have all the trappings of an elite unit of fighters with the highest quality equipment. However, it would be a mistake to compare the Blades, at least entirely, to a real-world military order, particularly the knightly orders. The reasons are complex, but I'll list off a few. Firstly, let's take an organization like the Templars. That is a religious organization backed by the Pope and made for religious purposes. This is not necessarily dissimilar to the Blades entirely, who do idolize the Dragonborn and the Dragonborn Emperors for their role in prophecy. However, the Templars are a faction that must stand on its own 2 feet. While they have the support of the Church, obviously, the Templars themselves actually began as what one might call a private security company, only with knights. They decided to guard the pilgrim roads of the Holy Land, and then they expanded and became not just a group of knights, but an almost international organization. They answered to no king and was supported by many aristocrats. Essentially, people would send them a lot of charity by the blessings of the Church. People could send things like, bread or socks, or they can send land or gold. Meanwhile, the Blades only serve one sovereign, whom they have a sort of quasi-religious devotion to, and they are supported as such. All of their wages are paid by the Empire, and for them serving imperial service. Now, a group like the Templars, or the Hospitallars, or the Sword Brothers of Livonia, any of them, began as a fighting unit, and that was their main purpose. The more they grew, the more money and equipment they needed, and so they built various commanderies, or preceptories, what we call them, which are the terms we use for knightly order chapter houses. And eventually, the overwhelming number of members of each order weren't the fighting knights and sergeants and squires or even priests, but money handlers, clerks, cleaners, cooks, tradesmen, blacksmiths, what have you. People that could gather or accrue money and support the knights who were out in the field. This is a completely different phenomenon from the Blades, who were supported again by the Emperor and his bureaucracy, and so they never needed to induct laymen into their association to keep themselves afloat or supported. Now, other than the standard military orders, there are 2 other units of history that can be somewhat comparable to the Blades. Firstly, we have the Varangian Guard. These are Norsemen, initially of the Rus, that served as the personal guard of the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople. Eventually, it was comprised of Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, even Anglo-Saxons, and the Varangian Guard was known for being extremely loyal to the Byzantine emperors and very good on the battlefield. And this is much like the Blades' origins of being the Dragon Guard, where they used to be only Saessi, however, eventually humans were inducted into the mix. However, the Varangian Guard were technically mercenaries since it was comprised of foreigners who were paid by a single paymaster, being the Emperor, and generally when the guard service was done, they went back home to Northern Europe. Very similar due to their loyalty, their combat prowess, and the fact it's a group made up of foreigners, at least initially, which is much like the Dragon Guard made up of the Saessi, and of course the Dragon Guard eventually became the Blades. However, again, the Dragon Guard and the Blades were not mercenaries technically. Now, the unit from history that would be on everyone's mind with comparisons to the Blades would be the Roman Praetorian Guard. Much like in Elder Scrolls, these men were the elite fighting force and personal bodyguards of the Emperor. However, unlike the Blades, the Praetorian Guard were not only disloyal, but notoriously ambitious. I will say people often give them more flack than they deserve. For a lot of their history, they weren't disloyal necessarily, but it is true that during a few tumultuous centuries, they killed 12 to 13 emperors they were supposed to protect. The number varies between historians, and one time they actually killed an emperor and then auctioned off the throne to the highest bidder. The early Praetorians, however, were pretty loyal, but as the centuries went on, they became increasingly corrupt and ambitious. This is very much unlike the Blades. Although you could potentially say that Delphine is kind of like this, because the Blades should serve and be subservient to the Dragonborn, and Delphine certainly is not, but it's hard to say. So let's look away from real history for a bit and give a brief overview on how the Blades came to be. It is an apocryphal tale, at least in all likelihood, but it is the best we have to go on. So, nearing the end of the First Era, in the year 2703 of that era, an army of Akaviri, mostly Sayesi, attacked the continent of Tamriel from the north, landing at Skyrim in a sudden assault and cutting through the surprised and scattered ancestors of the Nords. And if you don't know what a Sayesi is, they are essentially snake people that are said to be like immortal vampires, but there's a lot of contention on that, but yeah, they are snake people, essentially. They made it past the mountains before they were confronted by a combined army of men and Dunmer. The Dunmer, under the Tribunal, and the men were scattered tribes of Colovians and Nibonese men under Riemann I, a Dragonborn. After a brief battle at a place called Pale Pass between Skyrim and Cyrodiil, it is said the Sayesi capitulated en masse, at least when they heard Riemann's voice, claiming they found what they had come to Tamriel for. It is said they knelt down before Riemann to pledge their loyalty to him, or at least many did. Again, this story is likely apocryphal and could be completely false, or at least partially false, but people do often cite their kneeling as showing Sayesi as being more humanoid than snake. I won't go into it, but there's points for either side. Either way, this is what is commonly seen as the catalyst for the Second Empire under Riemann, or at least the beginning of the Riemann Empire that leads into the Second Era, essentially, and the beginning of the Dragon Guard, the precursors to the Blades. Now, a prophecy called the Prophecy of the Dragonborn is often attributed to the reason the Akaviri invaded and joined Riemann. The Prophecy of the Dragonborn was recorded on Alduin's wall shortly after they joined him, as in the Dragon Guard joined the Emperor, and a huge Akaviri mural of it can be found within Skyhaven Temple. Now, while the prophecy is not the focus of the video, I will recite it here to give some context for the Dragon Guard. When misrule takes its place at the 8 corners of the world, when the brass tower walks and time is reshaped, when the thrice blessed fail and the red tower trembles, when the dragonborn ruler loses his throne and the white tower falls, when the snow tower lies sundered, kingless, bleeding, the world eater wakes and the wheel turns upon the last dragonborn. If you're a fan of the series, you no doubt recognize at least some of those references. And of course, much of this is explained in Skyrim. Now, let's go to the Dragon Guard. The Dragon Guard themselves, mostly made of Sayesi, along with their arms and armor, became the Emperor's main bodyguards, with a secondary purpose of slaying dragons. In fact, some people say that a secondary reason they came to Tamriel was because the dragons fled there and they wanted to keep slaying them. This is somewhat different than the Blades. Yes, the Blades are the Emperor's main bodyguards and elite troops. However, they also serve as spies, agents, and masters of espionage. Dragon slaying is a distant third for the Blades, because the number of dragons were dwindling those years, and even when dragons are plentiful, they are not easily killed. And of course, right before Skyrim, they were thought to be extinct. However, back to the Dragon Guard. This order of warriors served Riemann and his descendants of the Second Empire for as long as the imperial line survived, which was roughly 217 years. After that, it was the time of the Akaviri potentates, or potentates. I say potentates, but people go back and forth. And the Dragon Guard was scattered, forming into different subgroups. Some became the Dragon Knights, others the Fighters Guild, or at least a part of the Crucible of the Fighters Guild, and still others became nomadic warriors that traveled the land, seeking the next heir to the Ruby Throne, which is the throne of the Cyrodiilic Emperors. These were the warriors that joined Tiber Septim when he emerged and pledged allegiance to him, and these are the warriors that became the Blades. The Blades being the truest heirs to the Drakengard legacy, one might say. Now, there is a book seen in Skyrim called The Rise and the Fall of the Blades. However, it is written by an anonymous source, and it is on the Blades' origins and their fate. I will read part of it here. Riemon is one of the first documented and widely accepted of the mythic Dragonborn, those anointed by Akatosh and Alessia themselves. Born with the soul of a dragon is what his followers would say. Reports differ widely on the nature of the battle at Pale Pass, but the end result is the same, that the remaining Dragon Guard, upon hearing the voice of Riemon Cyrodiil, knelt and swore their lives to him, their conqueror and their savior. Fragments from late First Era texts refer to the warriors dropping to their knees, saying, we were not hunting or did not intend. It says, there's a rough translation, continuing, we have been searching for you. They protected Riemon with their lives as well as his descendants as the Riemon dynasty ushered in Tamriel's Second Era. It was through these years that their reach extended and their order grew to become the Blades. Their conquest of the dragons complete, they only sought to protect the Dragonborn and through him the Empire. They reached their height late during the Third Era under the rule of the Septim Emperors. Despite their numbers, they kept their secrecy. The most visible and well-documented were the members who personally guarded the Emperor, still wearing the original Akaviri armor, but that was just the tip of the spear, like I was saying earlier. For the Blades were a larger organization, stretching to every corner of Tamriel. These agents were of every race. They were merchants, thieves, craftsmen, mages, and warriors, all acting as spies, protecting the Empire as needed, and operating in secret. They often acted alone, but some fragments speak of them meeting in secret fortresses across the continent. The most famous being Cyrodiil's Cloud Ruler Temple, where they hung the swords of those slain protecting the Dragonborn. Other maps speak of Windscour Temple under the great expanse of Hammerfell's Alikir Desert, Skyhaven Temple in the mountains of Skyrim, and Stormtalon Temple east of Wayrest. They were known to have a Grand Master, who often lived amongst the people, unknown to others, which is one reason why Joffrey seems like a regular friar. The nature of their communications, meeting places, and missions were known to only a few elite members. The only two to know all were the Grandmaster himself and the Chronicler, whose only job was to make sure the group's mission was never known but never lost. With the death of Uriel Septim and his son Martin, the Third Era came to a close with the Blades fortifying themselves deep within Cyrodiil's Cloud Ruler Temple as they waited for a Dragonborn to return when they would be called upon again. The Empire of the Fourth Era no longer saw the Blades openly protecting it, or the Emperors. That role is now filled by the Penitus Oculatus, a purely imperial organization, but the Blades continued their secret work to watch for the Dragonborn and guard against future enemies. The Blades were among the first to see the signs that the Thalmor and of the Aldmeri Dominion would not remain isolated within their borders forever. They could do what the Penitus Oculatus, servants to the imperial policy, could not, and thus earned the lasting hatred of the Thalmor. The warnings of the Blades were proved right, as it is well known to all. The Great War between the Empire and Thalmor consumed the Empire and nearly destroyed it. Emperor Titus Mede II eventually brokered peace with the Thalmor, but at a price many of us still bear. There are those that say the Blades still exist around us, in hiding from the Thalmor, waiting as they have done time and time again for a Dragonborn to return, for one to protect, for one to guide them. Now, let's give a brief look at the arms and armor of the Blades. Now, both the Dragon Guard and the Blades appear to have armor reminiscent of both classical samurai armor or Gosku armor from the Sengoku Jidai, as well as Imperial Roman lamellar armor. So it appears the Akaviri armor and the Blades armor leans slightly more towards the samurai design, and the Dragon Guard armor in ESO leans more towards the Roman design. This is far more prominently shown with their weapons. The main armament of the blades is the Akaviri katana, obviously sharing the same name and design as a real-world katana. However, why would they use this? It's a Sayesi design, apparently, and so what would be the weapon's purpose? A katana is purpose-built for the cut rather than the thrust. However, it can still thrust quite well. A katana is notably rigid in its construction. The blade does not bend like many European swords might. That can be both a benefit and a detriment in certain situations, though of course it depends. Now, the reason why katanas aren't spring-tempered in our world, which would make them more flexible, is because that gives them a harder, more devastating cutting edge. And it's also because samurai often would use them, or at least initially use them on horseback, although that wasn't the case later on, but you know what I mean. It makes it so that it's much harder to bend, too. However, if the blade does bend, it's bent permanently, unless fixed by a smith. That means it is edge-quenched in its making. So let's get to the most basic of basics. Both a rigid blade and a flexible blade are deadly if you cut someone, or stab someone. Both can survive bashing against armor. However, if you had to choose one, the rigid blade is better against fleshy or lightly armored targets because it can cut better, whereas a spring-tempered blade, like many European ones, can survive contact with armor better and needs less maintenance. Now, this makes some sense when you think about the blades being 1. Dragon hunters, and 2. Intelligence officers. Originally, the Dragon Guard of the Akavir were purely dragon hunters, and so they made blades that were curved and rigid to give maximum cutting power, and a decent blade to stab if need be, to fight large beasts. Yes, dragon scales are hard, but I would not say they are as difficult to pierce as steel plate. And a hard edge can help them cut through gaps in the scales, and the blades of the katanas are also used to slice apart political enemies or concealed assassins, rather than heavily armored enemies on the field of battle. And of course, it stands to reason that a snake person like the Sayesi would have a more sinuous, slightly curved blade, I would think. Yet, a katana would still not be a poor weapon on the field of battle if need be, and the blades wear the armor to prove it. Now, like I pointed out earlier, their armor is a mix between Roman lamellar armor and the samurai gasku armor. They even have the haidate thigh guards. It's very strange. As I mentioned earlier, the Dragon Guard we see seem to be slightly more Roman in appearance, despite the architecture and the weapons of the Akavir being more Japanese in style. You'd think the Akavir would simply be more Japanese and grow more Romanized over time, or vice versa, but it's difficult to tell if they were always mixed to some degree, though no doubt they did change over time, and they also changed Cyrodiil, as it is said their inclusion in the imperial military changed its military structure. I will say it is odd that the katana in the games is one-handed, when a katana is typically a two-handed blade, but they also have a daikatana, which would be an odachi in real life, and that is two-handed, and they also have a shield, which oddly enough looks more like a classical Hellenistic shield than anything else, so more of a Greek origin, or with Greek influence rather than Roman or Japanese. Anyway, I believe I covered everything basically today. I didn't go super in-depth in the Blades history. However, I think that's going to be so long I would make a separate video for that. If you want that, please comment below. But still, I do hope you guys enjoyed this analysis of the Blades. If you did, please comment below and give me your thoughts. I love your comments. Likes always help the algorithm. Subscribing would be great. And please share this video if you enjoyed it. Okay guys, have a great day, alright? Alright, see ya!